I want to talk about a common problem for both objectivists and non-objectivists. It's a problem of translation. Objectivists tend to use words the way Rand used them. Rand was very passionate about her use of certain concepts. Selfishness, altruism, intrinsic, objective, subjective, and so on. So when objectivists read mainstream philosophy or just talk to someone who's not an objectivist, they tend to pounce on, should that person ever endorse anything by calling it good because it's altruistic, they tend to pounce on that person. Oh, so you think you don't have a right to your own happiness? You think people should be self-sacrificial animals? If you want to influence people, you're certainly not going to influence them by doing that. But also mainstream philosophers, when they hear objectivists talk or when they read objectivist writings, they come away with the impression that this is a philosophy for people who don't give a damn about anyone else. This is a philosophy for people who ride roughshod over anyone in order to gain their own ends. Just yesterday, I had a conversation with a philosopher. I was telling him what I was going to talk about today. And I said, this is a kind of preview of what I'll be talking about. I said, Rand is famous for saying that charity is a minor virtue. But as a matter of fact, she said lots of other things that undercut that view, or at least undercut what that statement is typically taken to mean. And he looked at me puzzled and he said, oh, I thought she thought that charity was a vice. I said, no. So things are even worse than I thought they were. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about. So why does Rand use the term selfish, more carefully rationally selfish or rational selfishness instead of rational self-interest? She says it's because the popular meaning of selfishness is a devastating intellectual package deal. Selfishness is a synonym of evil. The image it conjures is of a murderous brute who tramples over piles of corpses to achieve his own ends. Then she gives another reason. She says the common concept of selfishness is a package deal. It commits the fallacy of failing to discriminate crucial differences. There's a crucial difference between pursuing your ends by trampling on others and pursuing them without doing so, and between pursuing whatever your desires might be and pursuing your rational self-interest. So in common parlance, and I think also she meant in philosophy, selfish is used for both, although typically for the former. But I have a criticism of this argument. What she's saying about the term selfishness is true for many ordinary language terms, including, for example, greed and wickedness. So should we adopt greed and wickedness as objectivist virtues? Well, what do you think? Someone who earns money honestly by his own efforts is called greedy if he ends up making a lot, excuse me, and doesn't want to pay high taxes on it. But also someone who makes money by lobbying for special favors from the government, or by cheating his competitors is called greedy. It's a devastating package deal. So should we adopt greed as an objectivist virtue? Okay, I don't think we should. And I don't think we should adopt wickedness either. But Rand had another argument for adopting selfishness. She says the exact meaning and dictionary definition of the word selfishness is concern with one's own interests. But is it true of all dictionaries? Does the Oxford English Dictionary define selfishness that way? No, it says, of a person, action, or motive lacking consideration for other people, concerned chiefly with one's own personal profit or pleasure. Okay, it doesn't say that it's simply concerned with one's own interests. Okay, so here's the popular image of a selfish man. The guy wouldn't even pee on you if you were on fire. And here is Rand's image of a selfish man. This is Ruark in the Quarry. In the Quarry, because he's not going to compromise his principles and take whatever commission comes his way, right? I couldn't find, this is Ruark looking at Dominique. He's just caught sight of her. I was hoping to find a picture in which he's breaking rock, but I couldn't find one. Very few people are going to, if they hear that Ruark prefers to break rock in a quarry to taking a really profitable commission that requires him to compromise his architectural principles, they're not going to say, oh, what a selfish man. And it doesn't matter how many objectivists use it that way. Okay, so Rand did respond to objections to using selfishness the way she did. And she said, if it's true that what I mean by selfishness is not what is meant conventionally, then this is one of the worst indictments of altruism. It means that altruism permits no concept of a self-respecting, self-supporting man, a man who supports his life by his own effort and neither sacrifices himself nor others. Before I proceed, I just want to point out that, as some of you probably know already, Masha Enright has a really nice talk on Rand's use of the term selfishness. I don't know if it's been published. Stephen, do you know if it's been published? Okay. It's on video, okay, yeah. So she hits every important point, I think. Okay, is Rand's contention true? The contention that altruism permits no concept of a self-respecting, self-supporting man, a man who supports his life by his own effort and neither sacrifices himself nor others. And when she mentions altruism here, she means the altruistic ethics. So is this true? Does American culture not admire the self-respecting, self-supporting man, a man who supports his life by his own effort and neither sacrifices himself nor others? Is it true to your experience, Rand's picture of the culture, which is not always a picture of the culture, right? If it's true that that people generally live by an altruistic ethics, then according to her, they should not admire the man who supports himself. Okay, I'll answer. No, I don't think that's true. If it were true, I don't think her novels would be so popular. Right? What about modern philosophy? When I started graduate studies in philosophy, I went around accusing philosophy of being altruistic or philosophical ethics of being altruistic. And my professor asked me, well, which particular theory are you talking about? And it was true, I couldn't name any philosophical theory that advocated altruism in the sense that Rand uses that term. The truth about philosophy, and I think also popular culture, is much narrower. So everyone is agreed that it's wrong to sacrifice other people to yourself. But popular culture and most philosophical theories, not all, but most, believe that sacrificing yourself to others can be admirable if done from noble motives or deplorable if done from lack of self-respect. So consequentialism or utilitarianism might be an exception. Consequentialism holds that an action is right if and only if it maximizes happiness or maximizes whatever it regards as the final good. But it tells you to take your own interests into account as well as other people's. But of course, if your interests are opposed to most other people's, then it requires you to forget about your own interest. So in that sense, it's self-sacrificial. But it's not self-sacrificial in the sense of saying your interests don't count. You shouldn't even consider your own interest, right? And then there are indirect forms of consequentialism. You say, no, the theory should not apply to the rightness or wrongness of acts. It should apply to the rightness or wrongness of principles. So Mill, for example, pretty much takes commonsensical principles and says that most of them are justified by the fact that when people live by these principles, then most people's happiness is furthered. On the issue of self-respect specifically, this is actually a very big topic in philosophy, the importance of self-respect and the badness of civility. And it's not, even though the date for this article is 1991, this is not a new concern. Kant talks about, condemns civility in his more psychological works. Eudaimonistic virtue ethics, which goes back to the ancient Greeks, has made a strong comeback in philosophy. And according to this ethics, your own eudaimonia, or happiness understood in a certain way, is your final end. So what does Rand think the basic principle of altruism is? Man has no right to exist for his own sake. Self-sacrifice is his highest moral duty, virtue, and value. The irreducible primary of altruism is self-sacrifice, which means self-immolation, self-abnegation, self-denial, self-destruction, which means the self as a standard of evil, the selfless as a standard of the good. And again, she says, altruism declares that any action taken for the benefit of others is good, and any action taken for one's own benefit is evil. Thus, the beneficiary of an action is the only criterion of moral value. And so long as that beneficiary is anybody other than oneself, anything goes. So I think the important point here is that doing good for others is typically regarded as moral, whereas prudence, doing good for yourself, your own long-term good, is often regarded as morally neutral. So as she pointed out, a lot of people think that communism is moral because at least it was altruistic. I was in Russia recently, and I was pleased to discover that our tour guides all condemned Putin. They said, educated people in Moscow and St. Petersburg, they don't believe anything Putin says. His support comes from not very educated people in small towns and villages. Okay, that was great. I also learned that actually there have been protests against the government for its actions in the Ukraine, and I don't think we've seen much of that in our media. But here's the depressing thing. One of these guides who doesn't believe what Putin says also said, the crimes of Stalin are well known. What is not as well known is all the good things he did for us. I said, like what? He built these subways, and yes, the subways are amazing because they are decorated with all kinds of art. Mostly, of course, it's communist realism, Soviet realism. But it's beautifully done. I've never seen such subways. And they're called the People's Palace. So she says, these subways and all these big buildings. I said, but lots of countries have subways and big buildings without killing millions of people. She said, so do you think that fazed her at all? No. She said, but maybe in Russia we wouldn't have them without Stalin. Hello? Okay, and I actually had a neighbor in Norman, Oklahoma, just a wonderful man, who said to me one day that Stalin, yes, he did a lot of bad things, but he even imprisoned my father for a while. But he also did a lot of good to Russia. He made us a great power. So, how many millions should die for Russia to be a great power? So great that it collapses of its own weight. Okay, so I think Rand this is a really important and central insight in Rand's writings. Doing good for others is typically regarded as moral. Prudence is at best regarded as morally neutral, not always. Sometimes it is regarded as moral. But I think she's exaggerating when she says things like, any action taken for the benefit of others is good, and any action taken for one's own benefit is evil. Most people would say, and certainly every moral theory I know would say, you shouldn't do good to someone who is robbing a museum, for example, right? I mean, you shouldn't be helping him because you feel pity for him because the poor guy, he's got himself stuck in the window. But again, self-respect really is respected in both in our culture and in philosophy. So no one would say that you should help others even at the cost of debasing yourself or being servile or being a slave. So I think she is exaggerating, and I was wondering why. I think it's because she's reacting to the collectivist self-sacrificial lessons she had to learn in the Soviet Union. I think what you have to learn when you're young can play a big role in your interpretation of people and theories. So again, let me ask you, how many of you were brought up to believe that they had no right to exist for their own sake? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Were you expected to choose a career that pleased your parents instead of yourself? Were you expected to marry someone who pleased your parents instead of yourself? Really? I mean, some of us here are immigrants, so we have immigrant parents, right? I mean, newly immigrant parents who haven't yet become quite American. But those who have American parents, I haven't seen that here. Yes, in India, in traditional societies, your marriages are often arranged, and even when they're not arranged, the parents may disapprove of your choice and may prevent you from marrying that person. Although, again, less and less, thanks to globalization. Okay, so from the show of hands, not many people were required to choose the career that pleased their parents or marry the person that pleased their parents. I think that choosing the career that will make you happy and marrying the person who will make you happy are very, very deep aspects of this culture. Or that self-sacrifice is your highest moral duty, virtue, and value. If that's true, then you were not expected to think that pursuing your career honestly, having the family that pleased you, that is the certain number of children and no more, were not regarded as moral. Okay, so what is sacrifice for Rand? Surrender of a greater value for the sake of a lesser one or of a non-value. Thus, altruism gauges a man's virtue by the degree to which he surrenders, renounces, or betrays his values. Since help to a stranger or an enemy is regarded as more virtuous, less selfish than help to those one loves. So, again, it's true that helping strangers is regarded as more virtuous than helping those one loves, quite often, but is it true that it's regarded as virtuous if you do it at the expense of your own family and friends? I haven't seen evidence of that in the culture, and certainly not in philosophy. Even Kant thinks you have a greater duty to your family and friends than to strangers. What do we mean by sacrifice in everyday discourse? Doing something for another or an important cause at significant cost to oneself. So it does not mean, typically it does not mean surrender of a greater value for the sake of a lesser one or of a non-value. So for example, the Western doctors who volunteered to work in Africa during the Ebola crisis sacrificed security and money. That's how most people would describe what they did. They would say they made a sacrifice. But sometimes people also use sacrifice the way Rand uses it. Remember, when we talk about people, how people use it, we're talking about tens of millions of people. So it's no wonder that they use these terms differently. It's also not surprising that sometimes the same person will use it in different senses. But the common core is doing something for another or an important cause at a significant cost. So the significant cost can be, it can consist of the exchange of a higher value for a lower value, or a lower value for a high value, or I guess an even exchange. So the Western doctors who volunteered during the Ebola crisis sacrificed, in common parlance, security and money. What about on Rand's definition? Did they make a sacrifice or no? Rand says, in effect, if you do V because you rationally value V over not V, then you are not sacrificing yourself. So that raises the question whether doctors being rational in valuing V. How do we decide? How do we decide on Rand's view whether it was rational or not? So is it entirely individual then? Some doctors may value it and some doctors may not, and they're both equally rational?
No.
Okay, what do you think?
No, I mean, yes, it's possible that it's certainly individualistic, but not every individual choice is not subjective. You can make an objective decision of whether someone did that in a way that was rationally self-interest or not rational.
Right. I agree with you, but how does one decide whether a particular doctor's decision to go to Africa was rational or not rational?
It would be difficult without going through an extended course of why they did this,
Yeah.
Specific. But if they did it because, for instance, which is because they thought it looked good in their peer community.
Yeah.
Let's just say peer pressure, which even in doctors is huge, especially for these sort of programs.
Yeah.
I've seen it personally.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah, so I think, there could have been people who volunteered because they thought they really ought to hurt themselves a little bit every now and then. Or people who thought, I'm a doctor, I can actually do something valuable there, much more valuable than what I'm doing here. So I'm going to volunteer. So yeah, it depends on your motives, depends on your reasons. All right, so here's this long quotation. And after reading it, I want to ask, is what Rand's saying here, does it apply to doctors or other first responders? And if so, how? So a rational person does not subordinate his life to the welfare of others, does not sacrifice himself to their needs, the relief of their suffering is not his primary concern. Any help he gives is an exception, not a rule. It is marginal and incidental, as disasters are marginal and incidental in the course of human existence. Values, not disasters, are the goal, the first concern, and the motive power of his life. How does this apply? Is this meant to apply to doctors or other first responders, like firefighters, paramedics, and so on?
No, I don't think it does, because that's their work. It says that a rational person does not subordinate his life to the welfare of others. He may give his time and his effort as part of his work to the welfare of others, but that's a different thing, in my opinion.
Okay, anyone else?
I think the major difference is that individual doctors of their own free will choose this because it is part of their life's work.
Yeah.
It is not done as a duty that someone else has inflicted on them.
Yeah.
Having entirely free choice is the difference.
Right.
And each individual doctor will have his own values to serve.
Okay. So in a sense, this doesn't apply to doctors and other first responders. In a sense, it does. It applies at the level of their choice of their career, right? to choose to become a firefighter or a paramedic or a doctor is not to choose a self-sacrificial life. Although people often describe it that way. It's to choose the life that best exercises your talents, actualizes yourself, serves your interests. That's what you're interested in. But again, a lot of people reading this would say, oh, so what is she saying about people who devote their lives to this relief of other suffering? And another question that this quotation raises is why Rand is contrasting values with disasters. Isn't preventing or helping out in disasters a way of preserving values? Those of us who've read her novels and read a lot of what she has written can understand that what she is against is this focus on disasters in a lot of philosophical ethics and also ethical conversations, right? People tend to think morality becomes relevant only when you are dealing with disasters, or primarily when you are dealing with disasters. Whereas she wants to turn our focus to building a life, to building the life that will make you happy, rationally speaking. But it's just a source of misunderstanding, and I've seen it misunderstood even by objectivist philosophers. All right, charity. Most people think charity is a great virtue. In early Christian philosophy, and I suppose even now, although I don't know how often it's actually discussed, but caritas is love for human beings, qua human beings, as human beings. So it's a love that's not given on the basis of the other person's character, but a love that's given on the basis of the fact that that person is a human being like yourself. Now, when Rand says that charity is a minor virtue, and she says this in the interview with Playboy, she's actually talking about acts of charity, not about a charitable character or a charitable motive. And I had also missed this till recently when I was writing an article on the unity of virtue in Rand. So in that interview, she's only talking about acts of charity. And the context is giving big sums of money to a cause like the Rockefellers or other rich people in this country. And she's saying that is a minor virtue, that kind of act. And I think she's completely right. I mean, it's how you made the money, that's the major thing. And then once you have the money, giving is relatively easy. But what does she have to say about charity, kindness, generosity, helpfulness in general as motives or character traits? She doesn't really discuss them explicitly much at all. And her attitude towards them in her novels is ambivalent. Certainly in The Fountainhead, there are lots and lots of passages where Roark is puzzled when he's called kind by anyone. Oh, when Peter says, "You're the kindest man I've ever met," because Roark is helping him with his project. Roark frowns and thinks to himself, is this what people mean by kindness? And it's obvious that that is Rand's question, right? It's almost as though she's led by the power of her art to make Roark this kind person and to have Peter recognize his kindness, but she herself is not quite sure if that's what kindness is. Okay, so in The Ethics of Emergencies, she says, people who are totally indifferent to anything living and would not lift a finger to help a man or a dog left mangled by a hit-and-run driver are psychopaths. I don't think she means literally psychopath, but the point is clear. She also says that it's appropriate to help a stranger only in an emergency or only when the risk to one's own life and only when the risk to one's own life or well-being is minimal. So I'm not sure why you are required to help a dog that someone else has left mangled, it looks like that's not an emergency, or is it?
It is for the dog.
What?
It is an emergency for the dog.
Yeah, but I mean, she hardly ever talks about animals except to show how much less they are than us. Anyway, obviously she disapproves of someone who would not bother to help a dog left mangled by someone else. But at the same time, she says it's appropriate to help a stranger only in an emergency and only when risk to one's own life or well-being is minimal. So illness, poverty, and ignorance are not metaphysical emergencies. All the same, it's virtuous to help a sick neighbor. Now, a sick neighbor is not a stranger. So this is consistent with what she has said about when it's proper to help a stranger. But why is it virtuous to help a sick neighbor? Because it's an expression of our generalized goodwill and respect for those who share with us the capacity to value. And Brandon says, and she cites him approvingly, that doing this kind of thing is profoundly egoistic. Again, most people are going to say, what? But I think he's right that it is egoistic in the special sense of egoism that is used by Rand, but also that is used in ancient ethics, Plato and Aristotle, so Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But isn't it also profoundly other-regarding? I mean, is it just profoundly egoistic? Is it not also profoundly other-regarding, what most people would call altruistic, but we don't have to? I'll just call it other-regarding. I mean, why are you helping the other person? Is it because you'll feel really good about yourself, or is it because that other person needs your help?
Well, she seems to be drawing a dichotomy between people you know and people you don't there.
Okay, but the point that it's an expression of generalized goodwill and respect for those who share with us the capacity to value. It seems you can, even people you don't know very well, can be helped in an egoistic way. It can be egoistic, it can be in your interest to help even someone you don't know very well.
May I say that something? The sense of life that we have of wanting to live in a good world includes counting on others to help us when we need it. There should be a general feeling of goodwill and benevolence.
Yeah.
And it doesn't hurt anyone for you to do something good in an emergency or if you happen to feel that you're in a position to help. So it's selfish to have the kind of world in which the right attitudes exist for people to deal with each other in a friendly way, in a benevolent way.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you have to go around like Mother Teresa and
Right.
clean everyone's wounds. It's up to the individual how much of themselves they want to extend or how much they have available to extend
Yeah, yeah.
and share.
All I wanted to say was, look, if this is egoistic, it's because it's coming from a desire to help someone else, another human being like yourself. She does not say that you should do this because this helps to create a world in which people help each other. Does she say that ever? Does she? I mean, we don't have to restrict ourselves to what she says, but I'm just asking you, does she ever say that? I don't remember reading that. The only explanation given here for calling it profoundly egoistic is that it does something to you psychologically when you feel connected with another human being, right? It's an expression of your own humanity. But why not admit that that expression of your own humanity is dependent on your recognition of the other person's humanity and his need for your help? I think this argument from goodwill and respect actually has wider implications than she recognizes. It can be used to justify charity towards strangers in non-emergency situations. In What is Capitalism, Rand says that people who are unable to work have to rely on voluntary charity. But if it's proper for some people to rely on other people's voluntary charity, then it's proper for those of us who contribute to it to support them on a permanent basis and not only in an emergency. Her view has evolved into something quite commonsensical, except for the terminology that's applied to it. And I think it actually has a further implication that is not to be found in the literature. It's sometimes virtuous to help strangers over an extended period of time, even at serious risk to our own lives. During the Holocaust, many, many strangers helped rescue Jews in Europe. One very famous case is that of the villagers of Le Chambon in France, who rescued about 500 Jewish children right under the noses of the Nazis. So there's been a lot of research on them as well as on other rescuers. And when researchers have asked these people, well, why did you do this? It was so risky for you and your family. A common answer was, we had no choice. We could not have lived with ourselves if we hadn't. Our help was no sacrifice. So here you see sacrifice being used in the way that Rand uses it. Helping the victims of a monstrous injustice was an actualization of their sense of oneness with them as human beings. So in benefiting others for their sake, they also benefited themselves for their own sake. So neither they nor the others were mere means, mere instruments or tools to each other's ends. Now, how are these terms used in mainstream philosophy? Selfishness is acting in your own interest without concern for others or at expense of others, as we've seen. Rational self-interest is acting in your own rational interests, and it doesn't always mean what Rand means by rational. Altruism is typically distinguished from abject self-sacrifice. It's typically understood as helping or caring for someone for his own sake and not only one's own or not one's own. Again, more than one meaning. Abject self-sacrifice I have not seen praised anywhere in any literature. Social scientists define altruism simply as helping or caring for another regardless of your motive. So Rand and some objectivists often talk as though we have to choose between acting only for our own sakes and acting only for another's sake. But I've not seen any good argument for this. And I don't think it's true to people's experience, at least before they become objectivists, because our theories influence our experience, or at least they influence the way we conceptualize them, the way we label them. So here's an example of this kind of dichotomy from the Fountainhead. In his defense, at his trial, Roark says that he builds only to give concrete form to his own truth, that his motive is the creation, not the benefits others derive from it. But what is Roark's own truth? Is it not determined in part by the physical and mental needs of the human beings who are going to inhabit his buildings? Does he arrive at his own truth independently of those who are going to live in his buildings? Here's another example from the Fountainhead. Here's Dagny thanking Hank Creighton for his help. She says, "You're saving Tiger Transcontinental a second time." Reply, "You used to be a better psychologist than that. Why should I give a damn about saving Tiger Transcontinental? Don't you know that I want to have a bridge of Reardon metal to show the country?" Does that strike you as good? Is that a good response to someone you love? I don't care about your projects. They're just a tool for my projects.
So in my view, that would have the other person feel free and not obligated, and feel that they owe a favor towards what has been done for them. So it could be said something to someone that you love because you do not chain them to yourself.
And I think there are times when we, just emphasize what we are getting from someone by doing something for them, right? I mean, no problem, this is good for me too. But he's saying more than that. Why should I give a damn about saving Tiger Transcontinental?
That dialogue is about the clearest way he could say to her that he has his own motives for that deal, that hers are not the only concern.
Sure. And that would be fine. He could say, it's not only because I want to save Taggart Transcontinental that I'm doing this, I'm also doing it for my own purposes. But he doesn't say that. He says, why should I give a damn? Okay. Why can't he care about both for their own sake? He thinks Taggart Transcontinental is a very worthy enterprise. He has goodwill towards the people it serves. He loves Dagny, who loves Taggart Transcontinental. That gives him 3 reasons to care about Taggart Transcontinental, even if its success is irrelevant to his own work. He's got 3 more reasons. Suppose you have a severely handicapped child. It's no fun to care for him, but you have an obligation to care for him. I think it's bizarre to say that your only or primary reason for caring for him is your own interest. Yes, you do have an interest in fulfilling your obligation to him. But where does this obligation come from? From his need and his relationship to you. Those are the causally and logically prior sources of your obligation and desire to care for him. And there are many, many interests that you have to give up for this one obligation, for your interest in fulfilling your obligation. Here's another. Suppose I accidentally step on your gouty toe. Of course, people don't get gout these days, usually. Causing you excruciating pain. So should I regret it only because it's bad for me? Why then do I have to apologize to you? I should apologize to myself. Same for stealing from you, assaulting you, etc. Is the only reason I shouldn't do such things that it's bad for me and not because it's bad for you? Why is it bad for me if it's bad for me? I think it's bad for me because I'm doing something that's bad for you. I'm violating your humanity and also my own humanity, right? And I'm having, the more people there are who are known to do these things successfully, the more encouragement is given to other people to do these things. Okay, intrinsic versus instrumental. Maybe I should stop. How much time for Q&A?
13 minutes.
Okay. I can stop and take questions, and then if there's time, I'll finish this.
Thank you, Neera. Oops. Is this up? Yeah, okay, thank you. I was speaking about interpersonal relations with a couple non-philosophic friends recently.
Yeah.
And one of them brought up a parable from the Bible that does seem, as at least I think as it's often interpreted, to advocate what Rand describes as altruism, the parable of the woman who was more noble because she gave everything.
Oh, yeah.
And so that seems an example, and
Yeah.
certainly the person I was talking to felt that the standard of nobility was the more you gave up. I don't see that as permeating American culture, and it doesn't permeate this person's behavior, but it is part of what's in the discussion.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm sure these views exist, but I didn't think that anyone describing American culture would say, like, this is a big part of it, right? Yeah.
Thanks, Neera. That was a great talk. One piece is I think you're right that the culture doesn't emphasize self-negation and total self-sacrifice. Yeah. But I think one way in which it does is that there is a big emphasis on self-development and growth, but it's not regarded as a moral issue. Right? When it's just a way of saying, well, that's important, but when it comes to morality, we're going to constrain morality to just being about dealing with other people. And so, yes, there's a cultural side, but it's not regarded as, we may consider it within a Eudemic, sort of an Aristotelian way, moral, but it's not normally regarded.
Yeah. I think
as
it's
moral.
mixed.
Is that not your perspective? Yeah. So.
I think it's mixed because if you are really successful at a difficult task, and you conduct yourself with integrity, and you undertake risky endeavors, people will praise you for your integrity and your courage.
And is that considered more in the general culture of my reading? It's not normally, people don't think of that as a moral issue.
Okay.
But fair enough.
Yeah, I guess we have to disagree. But what is not considered as moral is that you are working in certain industries or certain, like if you work for a bank, you're obviously bankrupt morally, right?
So maybe two quick comments. One is when it comes to Dagny and Hank, first of all, I don't think they're in love yet when that scene happens.
Okay, never mind.
They haven't built the bridge, they haven't gone over, they haven't, so that's, and therefore I think it's, I don't think that's the way any of us would express it because it would be impolite. But does Hank really care about, does he care about these? I mean, he cares that he has customers, but any one of them, I don't buy that.
But they're friends.
Yeah,
And-
so he has a goodwill feeling. But from a business point of view, he wouldn't change his business decision one iota because of that.
But that's not the context, right? I mean, is she so dumb that she doesn't realize what a true philosophy should tell her? Oh, thank you for saving Tiger Transcon a second time. Oh, I'm not doing it for you at all. I'm just doing it for I don't give a damn. I mean.
It sounds impolite, but I disagree. In fact, if I had a client and he told me he was doing it because he wanted to help this other person out, unless they had a strong personal value to them, I'd say, and that would still be a bad business decision. I think he's saying I'm making a business decision, and this business decision means that the value of you as a person or as a company is not my main interest. My interest is my company, and I'm not wishing you ill will. I'm not truly indifferent as it implies, but you're no different than, there's 6 billion people on this planet. There's 600 companies. I can't care about them all.
She's a friend. And he thinks very well of the way she's running this company.
So personal culture.
Yeah.
My wife has a couple of friends who are what I'd call social religious people, right?
Yeah.
Socialist religious people. And we actually had the debate where not only, it was not just a virtue to give to charity, but you had to give to a charity you didn't care about.
Okay, yeah. That's
if you
correct.
cared, it was selfish.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that example. I don't really know any religious people. So because philosophers these days, I mean, if any one of them does go to church, they keep it hidden.
The big thing that Objectivism promotes over previous philosophies is the worth of self versus the worth of the group. And your concerns should have primacy, but that doesn't mean they're the only things you should concern yourself with.
Thank you. That's the point I was trying to make. Why can't he care? Why can't he be wanting Tiger Transcontinental to succeed because it serves his ends and because it's a good enterprise, he has goodwill towards the people who use it, and he is a friend of Dagny's who loves Tiger Transcontinental. Why can't he have all these motives? That is my main question. Why does Objectivism, why does Rand think it has to be one or the other? I think most often we do things for ourselves and for other people, because they become part of people, especially the people we love. They become part of their interests become part of our interests.
Hi. Okay, so I wanted to go all the way back to the beginning of your presentation when you quoted Rand giving a dictionary definition of selfish as neutral, and then you quoted the OED with a pejorative definition. There's a very simple explanation for this apparent contradiction. That was then, this is now. I write about language. And there's always a big debate between the prescriptivists and the descriptivists. Dictionaries used to be prescriptive. They told you what to do. They told you what was right and wrong. Now the descriptivists say dictionaries should report on how language is used. And words words like enormity and disinterested are constantly misused, and yet you could look at dictionaries where the wrong definitions are given as if they're right. And words change meaning. Gay is an example. So it's a difficult problem. Rand was trying to change the language, to change how words are used. This is very difficult. I don't know if any studies have been done about them, but a lot of studies have been done on neologisms. And there are people who have tried to invent new words, and it's close to impossible to do it. Usually when a word enters the language, it's by chance and mistake and so forth. When you deliberately try to do it, it's very tough. And similarly, gay took a long time to change its meaning. Awful used to mean inspiring awe, in Victorian times.
Yeah.
So she has set herself, among other tasks, a very difficult one, saying this is how you should use the word selfish or altruistic. So it's a difficult kind of thing. I don't know what the solution is, but I can just provide a linguist's perspective on the matter.
Yeah. Well, actually, people pointed out that even then, the dictionaries were giving more than one meaning for selfish. So it's not just now versus then. Okay.
I especially like the second part of your talk where you're talking about, in many cases, my interests are bound up right with your interests, and so a much more expansive notion of the self.
Yeah.
The first part of your project was in part descriptive, building on Dawn's point, where we're trying to read the culture, where the culture stands, morally, so to speak, and we're partly trying to do that by figuring out how people are using words. But I wonder how you address the issue of you're always going to have different subcultures using languages in different senses, and you also have often a breach between how ordinary people use terms and how philosophers and other intellectuals want to define terms more precisely.
Yeah.
So the question then is, how do we decide what the right use is or what the best right use is? And it's not just a sociological reading of the culture, it is a prescriptive issue as well.
Yeah.
But let me also then feed into that. Part of it also is Rand's education was a European education, and so what European intellectuals are saying toward the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century is not necessarily what American intellectuals of our generation are going to be saying. So prosocial altruism versus a more robust self-abnegation, altruism. I just have a couple of quick examples here. This is one.
But I'm going to forget your first point, which I'd like to respond to.
Yeah, how do we legislate, so to speak, what the right use of a word is?
I don't think we can. So the only thing you can do is if you're writing a book or you're writing an article, you can say, this term is sometimes defined this way and sometimes that way. For my purposes, this is the best definition, right?
Okay. So just define your terms, be clear, and be aware that there's other terms.
Yeah.
But on this robust self-abnegation, it does go back a long way, as Paul is pointing out. But here's a leading French theologian who was canonized in the 1960s, about the time Rand is writing the essays. Quote, "You are here solely to immolate yourselves, body and soul, in the service of your Eucharistic King."
Who's this?
His name is Ayn Rand, and he was canonized in 1962, a French theologian.
Yeah.
And then a German, one of the top four philosophers of the 19th century.
Does it mean immolate yourself in the service of Christ?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. In the service of others. There is only one virtue, to forget one's own person, and only one vice, to think of oneself. Right? So we can find strong representatives of that tradition, but also strong representatives of just benevolent pro-social behaviors.
Yeah. So I guess I ought to pay more attention to the religious culture. But, a lot of things that people hear in church and might advocate are not things they live by, or they redefine they relabel what they're doing. But this is altruistic. This is self-sacrificial, right? The way I think objectivists say, this is egoistic. And without recognizing that it's also profoundly other-regarding. Okay.
Yes, I've told people already that I'm an objectivist or libertarian, and some have said, but that's so selfish. And my response is, yes, it is, in the best sense of the word.
Yeah.
And then if they want, I'll elaborate. What do you think of that?
yeah, I guess I would say, yeah, you know, it's self-interested and it's rational. What's your objection? Do you think I should be irrational, or do you think? I mean, it depends on where they're coming from, and also how they're living, right? I mean, are these people living in a self-immolating way, or they just are afraid of being self-interested?
Time for one more.
Okay. A quick one. To get people to accept being altruistic for selfish reasons is like multiplying by -1. If this were math, okay? On Hank's remark about not giving a damn about the railroad, I think that is very much in his character, the way Ayn Rand drew his character. He's blunt. He's not going to be softy and mushy. Even if he cared, he would not admit it, because he is stating his reason for having done the work. And he's charged her to the hilt. You know, he did not give it to her cheap, and she would have paid whatever it took. So I think it was perfectly in character for him to have said it that way. It doesn't mean that he really doesn't care. He just doesn't want to publicize that fact.
Do you think Rand would have taken the trouble to give these words to him if she didn't want us to believe that he meant them?
She never wrote a single word she didn't mean. She put it exactly the way she wanted it.
Okay, so...
But I would now say that current language, I'm a dictionary and grammar freak myself, and I belong to some grammar groups where we discuss these things at great heat, that language does evolve because new things come into people's lives, and we always use words that we are familiar with and make them into metaphors and similes, and then why do we have a mouse? You know, whatever we call things is based on something simple from before.
Yeah.
And so I hope we don't reach the stage that we have in Alice in Wonderland, when words simply mean whatever we say.
Right. So do you think Rand would agree that one can do something for oneself and for another person?
Of course.
Okay,
She
good.
said that herself.
Okay, well...
But I would say something else. Why she was so adamant and so extreme in selfishness versus self-interest is because she had seen how far the culture had gone in the wrong direction. And the only way to pull it back is to go as strongly as possible in the other direction. She wanted to be as extreme in the defense as the other side was pulling it off the hill.
I will give Neera the last words here and then wrap it up.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. And I enjoyed
All right, well, thank
Q&A.
you.
Thanks.